this is the story. I'm not a specialist of cemeteries. This is my first disclaimer, but it's really this lady's thought and beverage there, who contacted me, was last fall, and told me that along with Peter Garrett, I know you were somewhere there, Peter Garrett and Nancy of Messalonski Trails, of Kennebec Messalonski Trails, and Nancy Williams of the Waterville Community Land Trust. She was, and I'm now quoting Anne's email, on developing a pathway through Pine Grove Cemetery down to the confluence of the Kennebec and the Messalonski. We would like to create a trail passing by the most interesting grave markers and the graves of the most prominent early Waterville residents. So here you see some images from a proposal that Anne addressed to the Comprehensive Plan Review Commission in early November. Nancy Williams was gathering photos of Pine Grove, and I shared photos I had taken in July 2021 when I was working on a conference presentation that involved this painting, in picture and in real life, by Lydia Crosby Hayden here in the Historical Society. When I discovered that Lydia's brother, Andrew Crosby, was buried in Pine Grove, I hopped in my car and went to snap pictures of his tomb, just in time to include them in the PowerPoint to accompany the conference paper that I delivered the next day via Zoom. So in moments like that, I thought, it's easier to work on American art. Because normally when I work on European stuff, I can't just hop in my car and go take an additional picture. By the way, my paper was eventually published in that book. I loved it when I came. The book was resting on the couch. Of course, it tends to blend in a little bit. So in that book, and there you have the title of the paper, but in fact, that was the second publication that mentions Lydia's painting. Of course, I knew of Pine Grove ever since I moved to Waterville in 1994, and I lived nearby on Silver Street. What I love about cemeteries like Pine Grove is that they are like a park, a lovely wooded landscaped area, and yes, a very quiet one. This reminds me of the joke colleagues with whom I taught back in Switzerland used to tell. Every year, to celebrate the end of the academic year, we would have lunch in a lovely restaurant which happened to be across from a cemetery. And my colleagues would always refer to the place as having very quiet neighbors. Cemeteries are filled with wonderful monuments, and that, of course, delights the art historian in me. Here you see some examples from Highgate Cemetery in London, courtesy of a friend who recently visited it and sent me these photos when he heard that I was giving this talk here tonight. So what I propose to do tonight is a little survey of how different cultures have cared for their dearly departed. Be aware that this is not going to be a comprehensive kind of survey. I would need several lectures for that. So, where should we start? I have a question for you. What ancient culture comes to your mind when you think of a very elaborate funerary culture? Of course, ancient Egyptians and their pyramids and mummies. Indeed, we know a lot about ancient Egyptian funerary practices, to the point that the entire civilization became so associated with death that Egyptian art became a style popular for funerary architecture in the 19th century. As you can see, a whole selection of Egyptian-style tombs and mausolea in different places throughout the States and in Europe. At stake is how the living relate to the dead, how we want to honor and remember them, and whether we worry about them or even fear them or not. This, of course, is rich in information about beliefs concerning the afterlife. Take the ancient Egyptians. They believed in something they called the Ka, roughly equivalent to our concept of the soul. a life force, if you will, which would continue to live on after death. As a result, the ka needed a place, and that is why the body was preserved through mummification. But that was not sufficient. Sculptures, such as this one, would provide a place where the ka could reside if the body were to disintegrate despite mummification. Notice that this one is carved out of a stone called diorite, which is very hard and thus very durable. The pharaohs were buried with all the necessities. I'm sure you're familiar with the many objects that were found in King Tut's tomb in 1922. A sensational discovery that prompted quite an Egyptian revival trend during the Art Deco period. It's kind of funny that, Grauman's theater in LA is in Egyptian style, and look at the date. It was built the very year King Tut's tomb was discovered. The Etruscans cared for the deceased in a manner that is not so different from the Egyptians. See this tomb carved into the tufa, a volcanic soil that hardens when exposed to the air. The reliefs then received a layer of stucco that was painted to make the tomb look like a dwelling, complete with beams and furniture and all kinds of tools and implements, and even pillows, so naturalistically rendered that they seem fluffy and comfortable. The Etruscans believed that the soul would stay put if the tomb was filled with pleasant things, but they didn't believe it was necessary to have the real thing. A representation would do. The Etruscans were rather flexible in the way they treated the deceased body, practicing both cremation, storing the ashes in cinerary urns such as the one on the left, and inhumation, placing the body in sarcophagi like the one on the right. By the way, if you don't know that, the word sarcophagus simply means coffin. Here we see a couple reclining at a banquet. And by the way, in the Etruscan civilization, women and men were very much equals, unlike in ancient Greece, one of the most misogynistic societies ever. But you can see how they're really an equal pair. So here they're reclining at a banquet. This sarcophagus is really life-size. The subject of a banquet, a funerary banquet, is frequently depicted in Etruscan tombs, as you can see in this one. The ancient Greeks were not so much into elaborate funerary practices, but they did honor their deceased with grave markers. This large amphora takes its name from the place where it was found, the cemetery just outside the Dipylon Gate in northwestern Athens. It functioned as a grave marker for a wealthy woman, while also allowing offerings to the dead. There were holes at the base of that very tall vase that allowed the liquids you would pour inside it to kind of seep into the ground and into the grave of the person buried there. On the widest part of the amphora, we see a prosthesis scene, which was part of the Athenian funerary ritual, in which the deceased would lay in state and public mourning would take place. It was an occasion to display wealth and status. And you could cheat, because to reinforce the wealth and the status of the person, often professional mourners would be hired to kind of, suggest that, oh my God, that person is missed by so many people. But you are paying them. The depiction thus becomes a visual record of the deceased high standing in society, or you might want to say the illusion of it sometimes. The Greek archaic sculptures known as kouroi were grave markers, which also served as votive offerings. We know that the one on the right was meant for a grave. The figure is identified by an inscription that asks the passerby to, and I'm quoting the inscription, stop and grieve at the tomb of dead Croesus. So that's how we know that the dude who was buried there was named Croesus. On this Greek funerary stele from the classical period, we have a scene that was often used for the graves of women. The young deceased, Egiso, is choosing jewelry from a box held by a servant, adorning herself for the afterlife. You have to keep in mind that those stelae, like this one, were painted over. So you can't see the jewelry she's actually pulling because it was painted. On this Greek vase, known as the white ground lekithos, we see a woman making offerings at a stele, among which is a lekithos that resembles the one on which it appears. Ancient Roman portraiture may well have developed from funerary practices. Romans kept masks of their ancestors in shrines and would take them out and carry them in processions during funerals. Originally, these ancestors' portraits were done in wax, but eventually they were made in a more permanent material. By the way, if you've never seen the BBC series called Rome, which came out, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, 2 seasons. One is the very end of the Republic. Second one is the very end of the Empire. It was done with serious scholarly advising, and there's a scene where you see the masks being displayed inside a Roman villa. So there's an obvious connection between ancestor worship and naturalistic portraiture. You want to remember the individual exactly the way they were. The importance of representing an individual, warts and all, is so central to Roman portraiture. And by the way, we talk about verism, we talk about veristic style, as you can see in the label for the first image, which is almost like naturalism, but turned up, where you have a nasty thing here, you put it in the picture because that's really what allows you to recognize the person. In fact, interestingly, well, there in the middle you see a patrician Roman walking, with his ancestors, saying, "Here's grandpa, here's my uncle, I'm someone fancy." It's like your ancestor portrait gallery in your castle. But the one on the right is interesting because it was very likely made from a cast. So from the real person, and that explains why you get every single wrinkle exactly the way it was in the person. The idea is to really capture an individual in all his specificity. Ancient Romans had elaborate sarcophagi, often decorated with scenes that extolled virtues. On the right, we see a sarcophagus with Romans being victorious in a battle against barbarians. On the left, we see a sarcophagus and a fragment from a sarcophagus, which both depict scenes from the Greek hero Meleager, whose story was told by Homer, and who stood as the embodiment of what the Romans called virtus, there you have the word on the very left, a combination of qualities such as manliness, courage, and excellence. Meleager's virtus, or virtus, if you want to speak like the Romans, earned him immortality, clearly a great topic for a sarcophagus. Early Christians adopted the form, as can be seen in this late 3rd century sarcophagus, where we see a series of depictions, all with religious meaning. Starting on the left, we have the Old Testament story of Jonah. We see the ship from which Jonah was thrown overboard, the sea monster, in the Bible it's not a whale, who swallowed him, and finally Jonah resting under an arbor after he was spat out by the monster. Next, we have a figure praying in what we call the orant position, right, which was the way of praying in the early church. Then we have a man who's seated reading a scroll and thus appears as a teacher or a philosopher, a shepherd holding a sheep. That image is known as the Good Shepherd. And those two images, the seated figure and the Good Shepherd, both allude to Christ. But in that early period, you would not represent Christ. You would only represent metaphor, something that tells you something about Christ. but things will change. The subject matter of those depictions is Christian, but the style is classical. As you can see in the way the figure of the reclining Jonah is inspired by a pagan sculpture, the figure of Ariadne, the sleeping Ariadne. And it's interesting because it's a female figure that inspired the position for the resting Jonah. Now, many of those details recur in early Christian art. For instance, in the catacombs, where we find the orange figure, here's an example, Jonah, here you see two scenes, and again, Jonah resting under the arbor, and the Good Shepherds. The catacombs were the Christians who believed in the resurrection of the body and therefore prohibited cremation, buried their dead. Note that there are pagan and Jewish catacombs in Rome. So it wasn't just the Christians who used those complexes. They were dug outside of the city walls and consisted in a network of tunnels with rooms and niches for sarcophagi. And in some places you have several layers of such tunnels carved outside of Rome. They were in use from the 2nd through the 4th century of our era, obviously, of Christian, after Christ. And then during the persecution of Christians, they also served as hiding places. But eventually, the Edict of Milan in 313 put an end to the persecution of Christians and allowed the new religion to be practiced openly. That's why we talk about the Edict of Milan as being an edict of toleration. Didn't make the religion official in no way, but at least Christians could practice openly their religion. It was stopped being an underground cult, if you will. This sarcophagus held the body of one Junius Bassus, a Roman prefect who died in 359, therefore after the Edict of Milan, at age 42. An inscription tells us his name, and the imagery makes clear that he was Christian. We have a complex narrative program with 10 scenes from the Old and the New Testament. And by the way, in the middle, we have Christ. Now it is really Christ who's being represented. And just to show you a detail of one of the scenes, one you can all recognize, it's the original scene with Adam and Eve flanking the tree of knowledge with the serpent, whatever the word is. Coiling over the tree. Thank you. The practice, whatever. Actually, this is a nice, we were admiring that with Jessica earlier. The practice of carving elaborate sarcophagi continued in the Middle Ages, as you can see in the extraordinary tombs of the kings of Sicily, made out of porphyry, a stone whose color resembles the very expensive dye that was used in the emperor garments. It comes from a shell, a snail in a shell, the murex, and you've got to kill lots of them to get a little bit of dye. Very time-consuming, very expensive, and not nice for the poor snails. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, you find tombs with the effigy of the departed, who seem to be calmly sleeping while joining their hands in prayer or holding insignias. This is what we call gisant, from the French word, the French verb for to lay down. Here you see tombs in the French royal necropolis, the Basilica of Saint-Denis, just outside Paris, where there are no less than 43 kings, 32 queens, 60 princes and princesses. A rather macabre version of the gisant is called in French the transi. In English, it's referred to as a cadaver monument. It shows, as you can see very clearly, a decomposing corpse eaten up by worms, and in the example in Switzerland, toads, but also worms. The message of such unsettling funerary sculpture is also central to this famous Renaissance work by Masaccio, a fresco depicting the Trinity that appears above a tomb. At the base of the fresco, we see a grave, and above it, 2 kneeling donors, the deceased and his wife. Then, one step higher, stand the Virgin and St. John. Mary makes a gesture of presentation while John prays. Between them is the cross with Christ on it, and the dove of the Holy Spirit floating between the heads of God the Father and the Christ. This is one thing we always miss because it looks like it's his color, but no, it's the actual bird. Here, the rules of linear perspective convince the viewer of the reality of the scene. The vanishing point corresponds to the viewer's eye level. Furthermore, Masaccio's skillful use of linear perspective is at the service of a message that expounds on notions such as the care of the soul and the intercession of saints. As you can see, the holier the figure, the further away they are in the depicted scene, in the depicted space. The donors appear as kneeling right in front of the actual wall of the church, while the tomb projects into our space with a skeleton on it. Its side bears an inscription that reads, in Old Italian, Io fuggio quel che voi siete e quel ch'io son voi anco sarete. I once was what you are, and what I am you shall be. Cheerful talk, huh? The memory of deceased people right in the space of a church finds an amazing example in the pavement in Valletta's Co-Cathedral, this is in Malta, with the tombs of the members of the Order of the Knights Hospitaller of St. John, otherwise known as the Knights of Malta. The church was built between 1573 and 78, and in the following century, the entire floor was covered with marble tombstones commemorating 375 members of the order. As you can see, many of them have skulls and skeletons, a motif that continues in early American tombstones. In 2 of these examples, the skull is, as you can see in 2 of the examples, the skull is accompanied by the phrase memento mori, which means remember death. This is the message. It's such a dark picture. I hope you can see the details, so bear with me. It was worth using this one. This is a message that we find in 17th century Dutch paintings, where we see graves being dug in churches. For instance, in this one by Emmanuel de Witt, we see the interior of the Oude Kerk, or Old Church in Amsterdam, with on the foreground an open tomb. Can you kind of see it? And a skull nearby. The tomb has its tombstone propped up, and then a skull, as in, they've dug up some stuff as they're putting a new body in. And to be sure we don't miss it, there's nearby 2 men kind of pointing to the tomb, just a little behind the tomb. In the very background, again, it's not doing much good, there's a procession. You can go to the website of the National Gallery in Washington and zoom in, and you'll see. Not far from the tomb, this is a little bit more readable, there's a mother nursing a child. So what you have here is life and death, right? The tomb and the nursing mom are juxtaposed. Not far from the, surprising for us 21st century people is the presence of several dogs within the place of worship. And if you start looking at interiors of churches from that period in Holland, and people would make a specialty of a certain type of painting, because they were painting for the open market. So you need a niche. So people would specialize in church interiors, in landscapes. I can tell you about Paulus Potter, who really basically painted cows. The occasional horse, but mostly cows. So if you start looking at those church interiors, you will notice there's always dogs. But here, they're not just to tell us, yes, they're accepted in churches. That was the practice in 17th century Holland. There's more. These canines contribute to the moralizing message of this Protestant paintings. I mean, all those Dutch paintings are highly moralizing. Dogs are, of course, a symbol of fidelity, as shown by the one sitting next to the mom and child. But there are also a negative example. I don't know if you can see, one is peeing. Of course, you're all familiar with the churchyard, as we can still see in many towns and cities. Here's the so-called King's Chapel Burying Ground in Boston, which was established in 1630 and is the oldest cemetery in the city. But let's move forward in time and closer to us geographically, to Waterville's Pine Grove Cemetery. In the city of Waterville's website, we learn that it occupies a 32-acre parcel located on Grove Street, and that it directly abuts the St. Francis Catholic Cemetery, which was established in 1898. St. Francis, that is. Pine Grove, middle of the 19th century. Pine Grove has approximately 30,000 lots and an estimated 80,000 grave sites. The website goes on to mention prominent community members who are buried there, along with hundreds of veterans from wars as early as the Revolutionary War. So you might wonder why that is, since the cemetery was established in the middle of the 19th century. Well, do you know why? Jessica knows, but do you know why? Yeah, Anne? That were moved, right? They were buried in what became Monument Park. So there was a huge transfer of tombs to Pine Grove. So Pine Grove fits into a trend that started earlier in the 19th century of creating cemeteries that look like parks. This was the result of the growth of cities that had cramped churchyards. And at the time was also, people were starting to see them as unsanitary. Apparently, when there was a big flood, it was quite ghastly. You can imagine. So in a way, we could say that these new cemeteries preceded the move to the suburbs by the living, right? When you see where Pine Grove is, it's the same idea, right? Let's go to the countryside. Mount Auburn in Boston was the first garden cemetery. They were either referred to as garden cemeteries or rural cemeteries. It was the first in the US, established in 1831 over an extensive area of about 175 acres. My friend, the art historian and art critic, Brian Allen, says that, and I'm quoting Brian, it was always, and this is about Mount Auburn, it was always meant to be a cemetery and a public garden, as well as an outdoor museum of monumental sculpture, end quote. The first such garden cemetery was the Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, which opened in 1804. Here's an aerial view of Vienna's Central Cemetery, one of the largest cemeteries in the world. It's basically the entire green area, where you can see a church in the middle. The Viennese are very funny. There's really a very specific brand of humor that is practiced in Vienna, actually throughout the former empire. They have a joke about the Zentralfriedhof. That joke tells us a lot of interesting things. First of all, that it's an alternate city. And it really comments on its enormous size. But also, they poke fun at the Swiss, which I kind of like, when they declare that the Zentralfriedhof is half the size of the city of Zurich, but twice as much fun. So, in the remaining time, I would like to offer a few thoughts on the importance of cemeteries. What do we learn from them? First of all, they're a source of historical information. Early in my research on Lydia Crosby, I found her tomb online and thus learned the date she had died. I did not know that at that point, but seeing the tombstone, I got the date. As my anecdote about her brother Andrew shows, finding and visiting his tomb made him become more real, almost like meeting him, or at least I felt like I was touching history. In fact, strolling through cemeteries such as the Père Lachaise or the one in Montmartre, which I visited not too long ago with my cousin who lives in Montmartre, those cemeteries where so many famous figures are buried feels like paying a visit to friends and acquaintances. And that is why so many visitors still today frequent these places, orienting themselves with the detailed maps that list the most popular graves. There is even a certain camaraderie that emerges within visitors and devotees of certain figures buried there, as the sign in the Père Lachaise shows, helping other fans get to Jim Morrison's tomb. The very presence of Jim Morrison's tomb in Paris reminds us that he died in that city. As a grave marker, the tombstone perpetuates the figure's memory, but also marks a moment in history. Furthermore, visitors interact with graves as if the figure were alive. The monument perpetuates a presence. Tangible proofs of such interactions are the ballet slippers left at the grave in Venice of Sergei Diaghilev, the dance impresario, right, of the ballet Russe fame, or these moving messages addressed to Frédéric Chopin left at his grave. And they're really addressed to him, right? As you can see, Dear Chopin, etc. And one is in Polish. Walking through Pine Grove or perusing its maps, one notices family plots whose names still grace streets in Waterville. Appleton, Morrow, Getchell, or Sanger, just to name a few. Don't you think it would be a great project, I'm looking at you, Anne, for the Historical Society to produce a website explaining the origin of street names with a little history, for each of them? Here we see a double remembrance. I found the how do you pronounce it? Bautel or Boutel? Bautel, oh God, it's so hard for me. I quickly went back to Pine Grove a few days ago to add a few pictures to my PowerPoint, and I saw Bautel's tomb, the Bautel family tomb. So here we see a double remembrance with members of prominent families commemorated both at Pine Grove and through street names, which embed their memory into Waterville's urban fabric. Now, the presence of